Have you ever stopped to really think about what you eat in a day? Maybe it's a quick breakfast before work, a simple lunch, maybe something comforting for dinner. For most of us, our meals are just part of the daily routine. But what if you woke up tomorrow, not in your own home, but in the heart of the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago? What would be on your plate then? The story of ancient Rome is often told through the lens of emperors, gladiators, and grand banquets with exotic delicacies. But the truth is, the vast majority of Romans were not dining on stuffed dormice or sipping fine wine from gold goblets. They were ordinary people, farmers, soldiers, bakers, laborers, and their diets tell a story far more surprising, far more human, and in many ways, far more fascinating than the tales of the elite. We're about to journey into the daily lives of these common Romans, moving beyond the marble halls and into the bustling streets, the cramped apartments, and the modest countryside farms. This isn't a story of lavish excess. It's a story of survival, ingenuity, and the simple ingredients that fueled an empire. You might be shocked to learn that the backbone of the Roman diet wasn't meat or even bread as we know it, but a humble porridge called pulse, a simple mix of boiled grains that was the true daily bread for millions. And what about flavor? Forget the complex spice racks of today. Their world was dominated by one powerful, pungent ingredient, a fermented fish sauce called garum that was as common as salt is to us. So, if you're ready to discover what it truly meant to eat like a normal person in one of history's greatest civilizations, to uncover the surprising staples, the occasional exotic treats, and the sheer practicality that defined their relationship with food, you're in the right place. We're going to explore how their meals were shaped by social class, by law, and by the very infrastructure of their world. This is a journey into the heart of Roman life, seen not from the throne, but from the kitchen, a story written not in stone, but in wheat, wine, and the universal human need for a good meal. To truly understand the food of ancient Rome, you first have to understand its society, because what you ate was almost entirely determined by who you were. The Roman world was built on a strict, unyielding social hierarchy, and this division was never more apparent than at the dinner table. For the wealthy patrician elite, food was a spectacle, a powerful tool for displaying immense wealth and political influence. Their famous cena, or evening meal, could stretch on for hours, featuring a seemingly endless procession of exotic and expensive dishes designed to shock and awe their guests. We're talking about roasted peacocks presented in their own feathers, dormice stuffed with pork and pine nuts, and even dishes like flamingo tongues, all seasoned with a fortune's worth of imported spices and drenched in that potent fish sauce garum. But this incredible display of abundance was a reality for less than 1% of the population. For the other 99%, the plebeians, the freedmen, and the millions of slaves, food had nothing to do with spectacle and everything to do with simple, brutal sustenance. Their daily reality was a diet of sheer practicality, designed to provide enough energy to work, to survive, and little else. The core of this diet, the true staple that kept the empire running, was not the fancy breads we might imagine, but a simple, hearty porridge called pulse. This was a thick gruel made from spelt, millet, or emmer wheat, boiled in water or sometimes milk. It was bland, filling, and cheap, the ancient equivalent of a basic bowl of oatmeal that could fuel a soldier for a long march or a laborer for a day of back-breaking work. This fundamental divide wasn't just about taste or variety, it was about access and law. The elite had access to fine white bread, baked from expensive, finely sifted wheat flour. The common people ate panis plebeius, a coarse, dark bread often bulked out with bran, chaff, or even sawdust to make the grain supply last longer. For protein, a rich patrician might enjoy imported oysters or wild boar. For a common family, protein came primarily from legumes like lentils, chickpeas, and broad beans, with an occasional piece of cheese or a few slices of cheap, preserved meat if they were fortunate. This chasm between the dining experiences of the rich and the poor was the most basic, daily reminder of one's place in the Roman world. Your meal was your social status, served on a plate. While the social divide at the Roman table was vast, there was one great unifier, one ingredient that sat at the very center of every meal, from the emperor's palace to the poorest rented room: wheat. This humble grain was so vital to the functioning of the empire that it was more than just food. It was a form of currency, a measure of stability, and the very fuel that powered the Roman war machine and its massive building projects. The state understood this completely, which is why the Annona, the public grain dole, was one of the most important government institutions. For hundreds of thousands of male citizen residents of Rome, this monthly ration of free or heavily subsidized wheat was the difference between survival and starvation, a direct lifeline from the emperor himself, designed to keep the urban populace fed and, most importantly, docile. This system highlights an undeniable truth: the Roman Empire ran on wheat. But how was this wheat actually eaten? For the earliest Romans, and for the very poorest throughout its history, the primary method was a simple porridge known as pulse. Imagine a thick, bubbling pot over a fire, filled with spelt or emmer wheat berries, slowly simmering in water or milk until they softened into a dense, hearty gruel. This was the most basic, most ancient form of Roman sustenance. It was nutritious, incredibly cheap, and required little more than a pot and a heat source to prepare. A soldier on campaign would cook his ration of wheat into pulse in his mess tin. A rural family with a small fire would share a pot of it for their morning meal. It was the ultimate utilitarian food. However, as baking technology advanced and Rome's economy grew more complex, bread began to supplant porridge as the true staff of life for the common person. This was a significant shift. While pulse was sustenance, bread was civilization. It was more portable, had a longer shelf life if baked hard, and was far more versatile. But the average Roman living in a cramped insula or apartment building had a major problem. Most homes lacked a proper oven. Baking bread required a sustained, high heat that was a serious fire hazard in these densely packed wooden tenements. The solution to this problem gave rise to one of the most characteristic features of a Roman city street: the public bakery. Walking through a busy neighborhood, you would be guided by the unmistakable smell of baking bread long before you saw the bakery itself. These bakeries were bustling, soot-covered workshops, powered by large, wood-fired ovens and massive stone mills for grinding grain into flour. The work was brutal. Bakers and their slaves, often shackled to their millstones, worked in intense heat, breathing in a constant cloud of abrasive flour dust. It was a notorious profession, but an utterly essential one. For most city dwellers, buying a fresh, round loaf of panis plebeius from the local baker was a daily errand. This common bread was dark, coarse, and heavy, made from whole wheat flour that included the bran, giving it a dense, nutty flavor and a rugged texture that could be quite tough on the teeth. To stretch the flour, bakers might add barley, millet, or even less palatable fillers like bean flour or chalk. a far cry from the pure white loaves enjoyed by the wealthy that were made from finely sifted, expensive flour. The bread itself became a powerful social marker. The poet Juvenal famously quipped about the Roman populace being pacified by bread and circuses, and that bread was this very coarse, dark loaf. Its round form, often pre-scored into 8 segments for easy breaking and sharing, is an iconic image from Roman art and archaeology. In fact, we have a breathtakingly personal connection to this daily ritual from the city of Pompeii. There, archaeologists have unearthed carbonized loaves of bread, preserved in exact detail by the volcanic ash of Mount Vesuvius. These petrified bread rolls, still bearing the baker's stamp, show us the exact size, shape, and scoring patterns of the bread that was literally on the table the morning the city died. It's a haunting and powerful reminder that this wasn't just a historical concept. It was a real, tangible object that millions of people relied on for their very lives, the true cornerstone of the ancient Roman diet. This absolute dependence on grain, particularly for the massive population of the city of Rome itself, created one of the most fascinating and complex political institutions of the ancient world, the Annona. The term Annona originally referred to the yearly harvest, but it came to mean the entire state apparatus dedicated to the grain supply, and most famously, the grain dole itself. This was far more than a simple welfare program. It was a monumental feat of logistics, economics, and political engineering. The principle behind it was starkly simple. A hungry populace is a restless one. The poet Juvenal's famous phrase about bread and circuses wasn't just a cynical observation. It was a recognized formula for maintaining power. By guaranteeing a basic food supply, the state purchased social peace and political stability directly with wheat. Eligibility for the dole was a tightly controlled privilege. It was reserved for the adult male citizens of Rome who were registered as heads of their households. This immediately excluded women, children, slaves, and foreigners, reinforcing the idea that this was a right and a responsibility of Roman citizenship. Every month, these men would present a tessera, a small token made of bone or metal, to claim their ration of unmilled wheat. This ration was substantial, calculated to be enough to feed a man for a month, roughly amounting to 33 kilograms, or about 75 pounds of grain. While this didn't feed his entire family, it provided the crucial caloric foundation around which his household could build the rest of their meals, using whatever other income they might scrape together from manual labor or small trades. The logistical challenge of operating the Annona was almost unimaginable. Keeping a city of over 1 million people fed required a constant, massive influx of grain from across the Mediterranean. The primary source for this grain was the province of Egypt, which was effectively treated as the personal breadbasket of the Roman emperor. Every year, a massive fleet of specially designed grain freighters, the naves honorarii, would make the dangerous journey from Alexandria to the port of Ostia, carrying hundreds of thousands of tons of wheat. The entire operation was a breathtaking display of imperial power and organization. At Ostia, the grain was unloaded into enormous warehouses, the horia, which were engineering marvels in themselves, designed with raised floors and ventilation to prevent spoilage and pestilence. From there, the grain was shipped up the Tiber on barges to Rome, where it was milled, either by the state or by the bakers who held contracts with the Annona. The man in charge of this entire system held one of the most important and stressful jobs in the empire, the praefectus Annoni, the prefect of the grain supply. Appointed directly by the emperor, this was a position of immense responsibility. His task was to ensure the ships kept coming, The warehouses remained stocked, and the distributions happened on time. A single failed harvest in Egypt, a major storm that sank a fleet, or an outbreak of piracy could trigger a shortage. And a shortage in the grain supply meant panic, riots, and direct threats to the emperor's authority. We have records of emperors like Augustus personally intervening during grain shortages, going down to the forums to calm angry mobs, and dipping into the state treasury to buy emergency supplies at inflated prices. The price and availability of bread were not mere economic indicators. They were the most sensitive barometer of the emperor's popularity and the empire's stability. The Annona transformed a simple loaf of bread from mere sustenance into a powerful political symbol, a tangible contract between the Roman citizen and the state that fed him. While wheat was the undisputed champion of the Roman field and table, it was far from the only crop filling the larders of common people. The Roman diet was surprisingly diverse within its limits, built on a practical foundation of other grains, and, just as importantly, a wide variety of protein-packed pulses that provided essential nutrition where meat was a luxury. Barley was a major secondary grain, but it occupied a complicated and somewhat negative space in the Roman mind. It was widely cultivated and consumed, particularly in the countryside and by the very poor, as it was cheaper and hardier than wheat. However, its primary association was with punishment and inferiority. This is most starkly illustrated by its use in the Roman army. While the legionaries' standard ration was wheat, a soldier who committed a disciplinary offense would be punished by having his rations switched to barley. This was a profound humiliation. Barley was considered fit only for animal fodder, and forcing a soldier to eat it was a direct assault on his status and strength, implying he was no better than a beast of burden. Outside of this punitive context, barley was still eaten, often boiled into a simple porridge or used to make a rough, flat bread, but it always carried the stigma of being a second-class food, a clear marker of having fallen on hard times or occupying the very bottom rung of society. Millet and emmer wheat were other common grains that flew under the radar of such social judgment. Millet, in particular, was a workhorse crop. It grew quickly, required little water, and was resistant to pests, making it a reliable staple for small farmers and a crucial safety net in times of poor wheat harvests. It was almost exclusively consumed as a porridge, creating a thick, polenta-like dish that was a familiar, filling presence in many peasant homes. Emmer wheat, an ancient precursor to modern wheat, was tougher to hull and process, but was a core ingredient in the earliest versions of pulse, and remained in use throughout Roman history for its robustness. Yet, if wheat provided the calories, it was pulses that provided the vital protein for the vast majority of the population. For the common Roman family, a hearty stew of lentils, a mash of fava beans, or a soup made from chickpeas was the true centerpiece of a meal far more often than any piece of meat. These legumes were the nutritional heroes of the ancient world. They were affordable, easy to store for long periods, and incredibly versatile in cooking. A pot of lentils boiled with a little onion, garlic, and perhaps a handful of herbs could feed a family nutritiously and cheaply. Chickpeas were roasted as a snack, boiled into soups, or ground into flour to stretch more expensive wheat flour. Fava beans were another ubiquitous staple, consumed fresh when in season or dried for use throughout the year. The importance of these pulses cannot be overstated. In a world where livestock was valuable primarily for labor, milk, or wool, and where meat was expensive and spoiled quickly, legumes were the primary source of protein for millions. They were the difference between mere survival and a reasonably healthy diet. Archaeological evidence from sites across the empire consistently finds remnants of these foods in the dwellings of ordinary people, a testament to their foundational role. They were the quiet, dependable, and utterly essential counterpart to the dominant grains, forming the complete protein and carbohydrate engine that powered the hands that built the roads, forts, and aqueducts of the ancient world. This humble combination of gruel, coarse bread, and bean stew was the real fuel of the Roman Empire, a fact far more telling than any record of a patrician's exotic feast. But while grains and legumes formed the caloric bedrock of the diet, flavor and variety came from the humble vegetable patch. For ordinary Romans, the world of fresh produce was not found in exotic imports, but in the hardy, reliable staples they could grow themselves in small garden plots or afford to buy from the local market. This was a practical, earthy selection of vegetables, each chosen for its ability to grow well, store for a reasonable time, and provide substance to a simple pot of stew. Chief among them were the alliums, onions, garlic, and leeks. These pungent bulbs were the undisputed flavor foundation of Roman cooking, used in staggering quantities to add a powerful, savory depth to otherwise bland pots of pulse or lentil stew. Garlic, in particular, was believed to impart strength and was consumed eagerly by soldiers and laborers alike. The cabbage family was another cornerstone of the common table. Romans grew several varieties of cabbage and kale, valuing them not only for their taste, but also for their purported medicinal qualities. They were often simply boiled or chopped raw into a salad, providing a crucial hit of vitamins and fiber. Lettuce was also popular, though the Roman varieties were likely more bitter and sturdy than the soft heads we eat today, and they were frequently cooked or served with sharp dressings to offset their bitterness. Root vegetables provided essential ballast, especially through the colder months. Turnips and parsnips were boiled and mashed or added to stews, their sweetness concentrating as they cooked. Radishes were eaten raw as a sharp, peppery snack or garnish. These vegetables were celebrated for their hardiness and their ability to be stored in cool, dark places, making them a reliable source of food long after the harvest had ended. Beyond these basics, ordinary Romans might also enjoy cucumbers, mushrooms foraged from the woods, and, for those living near the coast, various types of edible seaweed. The key to accessing these vegetables was hyper-local production. Most city dwellers did not have the land for a substantial garden, but they might have a few pots of herbs on a windowsill. Instead, they relied on a network of small-scale market gardeners who farmed the fertile land just outside the city walls, bringing their fresh produce into the urban markets daily. For those in the countryside, a small kitchen garden was a standard feature of even the most modest farm, an essential source of daily nourishment. The cooking method for these vegetables was almost universally simple: boiling. A single pot over the fire would contain a medley of chopped vegetables, perhaps with a handful of pulses or a bit of grain, all simmering together into a thick, hearty stew. This one-pot meal was the ultimate expression of practicality, minimizing both fuel costs and cleanup. The resulting dish was a wholesome, if monochromatic, blend of flavors, a world away from the elaborate saucing of elite cuisine, but a dependable and nutritious reality for the millions who built the empire with their daily labor. For the vast majority of Romans, a meal centered around a large cut of meat was an almost unimaginable luxury, a sight reserved for festival days or the tales told about the wealthy. The common reality was far more modest. When animal protein did appear on the table of a working family, it was usually in the form of pork. Pigs were the most practical livestock for the poor. They could be raised in small pens, fed on household scraps, and didn't require vast pastures like cattle. A family might keep a single pig, fattening it over the year to be slaughtered, providing a brief but glorious period of fresh meat. But this was a rare event. The real value of the pig was its incredible versatility and ability to be preserved. Every part of the animal was used, transformed through salting, smoking, and drying into a pantry full of long-lasting provisions. This is where the common Roman got their taste of meat. In thin slices of salty bacon used to flavor a pot of beans, in small, hard sausages loaded with herbs and fat, or in a precious chunk of salt-cured ham. These preserved meats were not the main event but rather a flavoring agent, a way to impart a rich, savory, meaty essence to a large pot of grains or legumes, making a little go a very long way. For those living near the coast or a major river, fish offered a more accessible, though still limited, source of protein. But forget the grand turbot and red mullet that graced patrician feasts. The common person's fish was the humble sardine, anchovy, or sprat. These small, oily fish were caught in massive numbers, were relatively cheap, and could be eaten whole. They were often simply grilled over a small fire or added to stews. However, the most profound way fish entered the Roman diet was not as a whole creature but as a liquid, garum. This fermented fish sauce was the universal condiment of the Roman world. The ketchup, soy sauce, and Worcestershire sauce of antiquity all rolled into one. It was made by layering small fish like anchovies with salt and herbs in large vats and leaving them to ferment in the sun for weeks or even months. The resulting pungent, amber-colored liquid was then drained off and bottled. Garum was used in virtually every savory dish, from the simplest vegetable stew to the most complex patrician sauce, providing a powerful hit of umami and salt that could elevate even the most basic ingredients. For a poor family, a few drops of this potent, salty sauce could make a bowl of bland pulse taste profoundly richer and more complex. Within the home, the most reliable and consistent sources of protein came from the dairy yard and the chicken coop. Cheese, almost always made from sheep or goat's milk rather than more expensive cow's milk, was a staple. It was a practical way to preserve milk and was produced in small farms across Italy. This cheese was likely firm, salty, and good for grating or crumbling over food, adding a tangy, fatty punch to a meal. Eggs, too, were a cherished resource. A family with a few chickens would have a regular supply of them. They were boiled, fried, and used as a binding agent in other dishes, offering a precious and self-renewing source of nourishment. An egg could turn a simple meal into something special, a small package of complete nutrition that was within reach of many. So, while the feasts of the elite featured whole roasted boars and platters of oysters, the protein on a common plate was a subtle, scattered affair. A few crumbles of sharp cheese over lentils, a single boiled egg sliced into a salad, a few tiny sardines grilling on a fire, or the deep, savory flavor of garum tying an entire humble meal together. It was a cuisine of ingenuity, where every scrap of animal product was valued and utilized to its absolute fullest. But of all the flavors that defined Roman cooking, one stands above all others, not for its subtlety, but for its sheer, overpowering presence in every corner of the empire. We've mentioned it in passing, but it deserves its own story because without it, you cannot understand the Roman palate. This ingredient was garum, a fermented fish sauce that was quite literally the taste of ancient Rome. Imagine if every single savory dish you ever ate, every stew, every dressing, every sauce, every marinade was seasoned with the same fundamental condiment. That was the reality for Romans of every class. It was their ketchup, their soy sauce, their Worcestershire sauce, and their table salt, all combined into one potent, briny, umami-rich liquid. The production of garum was an industry in itself, and the process was both simple and stomach-churning to the modern sensibilities. It was made in massive, open-air factories called satarii, often located in coastal towns like modern-day Spain and Portugal. The recipe was straightforward. Layers of small, oily fish-like sardines, anchovies, or mackerel were packed into huge clay vats or stone tanks with masses of salt and aromatic herbs. This pungent mixture was then left to ferment under the hot Mediterranean sun for weeks or even months. The sun's heat would slowly break down the fish, liquefying them. Eventually, the rich, amber-colored liquid that rose to the top would be drained off through a spigot at the bottom of the vat. This first straining was the premium, high-quality garum, known as liquemen in some contexts. The thick, pasty sludge left at the bottom was called a lek, a cheaper, inferior paste that was still used by the very poor as a spread or a potent flavor booster. And just like olive oil or wine today, garum came in a vast range of qualities and price points, a clear marker of social status. At the very top was garum socirum, considered the finest and most expensive variety, allegedly made from prized mackerel in the workshops of Carthago Nova in Spain. This was the vintage champagne of fish sauce, a clear, complex liquid exported in delicate glass bottles to the tables of the elite, who would drizzle it delicately over their food. Then there was the standard workhorse garum used by the masses, sold from large amphorae in every market. At the very bottom of the scale was muria, a cheaper, saltier brine made from tuna or from the second pressing of the fish mash. For a common soldier or laborer, this was likely the version they could afford, a powerful, salty kick to make their daily pulse or bread more palatable. The uses for this ubiquitous sauce were nearly endless. Cookbooks from the time, like the famous Apicius, use it in almost every recipe. It was used as a cooking ingredient, stirred into stews and poured over roasting meat. It was a table condiment, kept in a bottle on the table next to the salt for people to add as they wished. It was the base for countless compound sauces, mixed with wine onogarum, vinegar oxygarum, pepper, or herbs. It was even believed to have medicinal properties, prescribed for everything from dog bites to dysentery. The smell of a garum factory would have been overwhelming, and the taste, for the uninitiated, is often described as an intense, funky, salty anchovy paste. But for the Romans, this was not a foreign or challenging flavor. It was the very essence of savory goodness, the fundamental fifth taste of umami that made their food taste complete. To eat in ancient Rome was to taste garum. It was the invisible, pungent thread that tied the empire's cuisine together, from the grandest patrician cena to the simplest soldier's mess. Beyond the savory staples of grains and vegetables, the Roman diet was sweetened by the bounty of fruit and nut trees that grew abundantly across the Italian peninsula and the wider empire. While the wealthy might indulge in expensive, exotic imports like dates from Africa or citrons from the East, the common person's fruit bowl was filled with humble, locally grown, and often foraged treats that provided vital vitamins and a welcome burst of natural sweetness. Foremost among these was the fig. This fruit was a true staple, incredibly common, easy to dry for preservation, and packed with energy, Fig trees grew like weeds and required little care, making them a perfect resource for even the poorest families. Fresh figs were a fleeting summer delight, but dried figs were a year-round food, a chewy, sugary snack that could be carried by soldiers, laborers, and children alike. They were so integral to the diet that Cato the Elder, in his writing on agriculture, used the phrase, to give someone figs, to mean providing the most basic form of sustenance. Grapes were another pillar of this common fruit culture. While the elite celebrated fine vintages from prestigious hillsides, for the average person, grapes were first and foremost of food. They were eaten fresh off the vine in late summer and autumn, a juicy, refreshing treat, but their greater importance lay in their dried form. Raisins were a crucial preserved food, a concentrated source of energy that was added to breads, porridges, and stews to provide sweetness and calories during the long winter months. A handful of raisins could transform a simple loaf of barley bread or a bowl of pulse into something special. Alongside these, a variety of other orchard fruits were widely enjoyed. Apples, pears, plums, and cherries were all cultivated and available in local markets. These fruits were often smaller, tartar, and less uniform than the varieties we know today, but they were no less appreciated. They were typically eaten raw when in season, cooked down into simple preserves, or stored in cool, dark cellars to extend their edible life for a few precious weeks. The Roman landscape also provided a reliable harvest of nuts, which served as an essential source of healthy fats and protein. Walnuts, chestnuts, and hazelnuts were the most common, gathered from wild trees or cultivated in orchards. These were not merely occasional snacks. They were functional ingredients in the daily diet. Walnuts and hazelnuts were often crushed and added to bread dough or used to thicken and enrich sauces and stews, providing a nutty depth and nutritional boost. Chestnuts held a particularly important place, especially for those living in mountainous regions where other crops fared poorly. They were so nutritious and abundant that they were nicknamed the bread tree. Chestnuts could be boiled, roasted, or, most commonly, dried and ground into a coarse, gluten-free flour. This chestnut flour was then used to make a dense, sweet bread or porridge that became a dietary cornerstone for many communities outside the prime wheat-growing areas. For a child in ancient Rome, a pocketful of roasted nuts was the equivalent of a modern energy bar, a portable, satisfying, and nutritious snack that was accessible to nearly everyone. This everyday world of fruits and nuts reveals a diet that was far from monotonous. It was attuned to the seasons, rich in natural flavors, and demonstrated a clever use of the land's natural abundance to bring variety and vitality to the common table. Of course, staying hydrated and finding safe, palatable drinks was just as crucial to daily survival as solid food, and the Romans had some surprisingly effective solutions. In a world without coffee, tea, or safe pasteurization, the common Roman's choice of beverage was a matter of practicality, health, and sometimes grim necessity. The most obvious drink was water, but its quality was a constant and serious concern. For the fortunate few who lived in a city like Rome, the majestic aqueducts brought a relatively clean and plentiful supply from miles away. This water flowed into public fountains, which were the lifeline for the millions of residents living in cramped insulae without running water. Every day, a constant stream of people, mostly women and slaves, would gather at these fountains with jars and buckets to collect the day's supply for drinking, cooking, and washing. However, this water was not treated in any modern sense. As it flowed through the extensive lead pipes of the city's distribution system and sat in public basins, it could be contaminated. For the rural poor, the situation was even more precarious. They relied on wells, springs, or local rivers, which were vulnerable to runoff from farms, animals, and human waste. Drinking untreated, bad water was a quick path to dysentery and other deadly waterborne illnesses. So, while water was consumed, it was often viewed with a degree of suspicion, leading most Romans to prefer their daily liquids in a form that was inherently safer and more stable. The ultimate solution for the masses, especially soldiers and the very poor, was a deceptively simple drink called pasca. This was not a fancy beverage, but a brilliantly practical one. Pasca was made by mixing sour, low-quality wine that had turned to vinegar with water. Sometimes it was flavored with herbs like coriander or a handful of fennel. To our modern tastes, it might sound unappealing, but for a Roman, it was a lifesaver. The acetic acid in the vinegar acted as a mild antiseptic, killing off some of the harmful bacteria in the water. This made it significantly safer to drink than plain water from a questionable source. For a soldier on a long, dusty march, a sip of pasca from his canteen was not just refreshing. It was a dose of hydration that was far less likely to make him sick and incapacitate him. It was cheap, easy to produce in massive quantities, and provided a slight energy boost. The Roman army ran on pasca as much as it did on wheat. It was the official beverage of the legions, issued as part of the standard ration to keep the greatest fighting force in the ancient world hydrated and healthy. But the most beloved daily drink, the true staple for all classes, was wine. However, we must completely discard our modern image of sipping a fine vintage from a glass. The common Roman drank a very different product. This was not the carefully aged Falernian wines celebrated by poets. It was a rough, acidic, often pungent red wine that was almost always watered down. Drinking wine straight was considered a barbaric practice, the mark of a drunkard. A proper Roman would mix their wine with hot or cold water in a large jar called a crater, often using a ratio of 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water. This dilution made the wine last longer, reduced its potency for a day that required clear-headed work, and made it more refreshing. This cheap vinum ordinarium was the drink you would find in every tavern, every workshop, and every modest home. It was likely tart and tannic, sometimes requiring the addition of a little honey to sweeten it or spices to mask its flaws. It was consumed throughout the day, from a light breakfast cup to the main drinking that occurred at the evening meal. For the average laborer, a trip to the local taberna after a long day's work for a cup of this watered-down wine was the ancient equivalent of stopping for a beer with friends, a moment of relaxation and community. Even slaves were given a ration of this low-grade wine. So, while the elite might debate the merits of a particular vintage from a specific hillside, the common Roman's experience of wine was a functional, social, and daily ritual. It was a safe source of liquid, a small pleasure, and a humble but essential thread in the fabric of ordinary life, proving that even in their drinks, Romans prioritized practicality above all else. Now, to bring all of these ingredients to life, we have to step into the heart of the Roman home, the kitchen. But for the vast majority of people, this wasn't a separate room filled with specialized equipment. For a family living in a cramped urban apartment or a modest rural farmhouse, the kitchen was wherever you could safely contain a fire. For many, this meant a simple, portable brazier, a metal dish or small pot standing on legs, filled with burning charcoal. This humble source of heat was the entire culinary world for millions. It could be placed on a stone floor or even carried out into a courtyard. and it provided just enough focused heat to boil a pot of porridge or grill a few small fish. In the slightly more fortunate households, you might find a fixed hearth, a simple stone or brick construction that was a step up in both safety and capability. But the true luxury, a proper built-in oven for baking bread, was almost exclusively the domain of public bakeries and the villas of the very wealthy. This fundamental limitation of heat sources dictated everything about how common Romans cooked. The one-pot meal wasn't just a preference, it was a necessity. A single sturdy ceramic or bronze pot, known as a kakebis or olla, was the most vital piece of cookware. This pot would spend its life suspended over the fire from a chain or resting directly in the embers, constantly simmering with the day's nourishment. Inside it, pulses, grains, and chopped vegetables would bubble away together for hours, slowly softening and melding their flavors into a thick, hearty stew. This method was brilliantly efficient, requiring minimal fuel and constant attention, making the most of every scrap of heat and every ingredient. Beyond the all-important pot, a few other basic tools rounded out the common kitchen. A flat bronze or iron pan, called a fretale or sartego, was used for frying pancakes, eggs, or those precious slices of preserved meat. A simple grill, essentially a metal grate placed over the brazier, allowed for the quick cooking of small fish or the toasting of bread. And of course, every home had the essential tools for preparation: a mortar and pestle for grinding herbs, spices, and salt into powders, and a simple knife for chopping vegetables. The entire culinary process was one of beautiful, brutal simplicity. There was no need for whisks, timers, or measuring cups. Cooking was a sensory experience, judging the heat by the color of the coals, testing the doneness of the porridge by its consistency, and seasoning to taste with a heavy hand of salt and a few precious drops of that ubiquitous garum. This wasn't a hobby. It was a daily act of survival, a ritual of transforming simple, raw ingredients into the warm, filling fuel that would see a family through another day of work in the ancient world. So what did this daily routine of cooking and eating actually look like for an ordinary person? The rhythm of a Roman's day was marked by 3 distinct meals, each with its own purpose and character, far removed from the multi-course feasts of legend. The day began not with a lavish spread, but with a simple and practical breakfast known as intaculum. This was a meal designed for speed and efficiency, eaten at sunrise to fuel the body for the long day of labor ahead. For most, it was a quiet, solitary affair. The remains of yesterday's coarse bread, perhaps slightly stale, would be dipped in a little wine or water to soften it, or spread with a bit of soft cheese or honey if the household was fortunate. A handful of leftover olives, a few nuts, or a piece of dried fruit might round it out. There was no cooking involved, no fire to be lit. It was about grabbing what was readily available from the pantry and consuming it quickly before heading out to the fields, the workshop, or the bustling streets of the city. This meal was purely functional, a burst of calories to start the engine, a humble beginning to a demanding day. By midday, the sun was high, and work was in full swing, leaving no time for a break to return home or prepare a hot meal. This was the hour for prandium, the Roman lunch, which was perhaps the most minimalist meal of the day. It was almost always cold, portable, and eaten swiftly at one's place of work, or purchased from a street vendor. A laborer might unwrap a cloth containing more bread, a chunk of cheese, some cold beans from last night's stew, or a few slices of that salty, preserved sausage. For those with a few coins to spare, the thriving street food culture of ancient Rome offered a quick solution. They could grab a hot snack from a thermopolium, one of the countless Roman fast food counters that line the streets of cities like Pompeii. These shops featured large clay jars called dolia embedded in their counters, filled with ready-to-eat hot stews, soups, and roasted meats. A customer could walk up, order a bowl of lentil stew or a serving of grilled sausages, and be on their way in moments, eating their lunch standing up or taking it back to their job site. Prandium was not a social event or a leisurely pause. It was a refueling stop, a necessary interruption in the workday to restore energy without sacrificing precious time or productivity. All of this daily exertion built towards the main event of the Roman culinary day, the cena or evening meal. For the common family, this was not a multi-course banquet, but a cherished moment of respite and gathering. As the sun set and the day's work was finally done, the family would come together around the hearth or the small brazier. This is where that single, all-important pot, having simmered for hours, finally came into its own. The cena was typically a one-pot wonder, a thick, hearty stew that was the culmination of the day's resources. Into this pot went everything, the core of boiled grains like spelt or barley, a generous portion of lentils or chickpeas for protein, and whatever vegetables were in season: onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, all slowly cooked down into a nourishing and filling blend. The flavor came from a generous dose of garlic, herbs from the garden, and, of course, that essential splash of garum to give it a deep, savory richness. This communal pot was served directly into bowls, and the family would share it, sopping up the last bits with their bread. This evening meal was about more than just calories. It was the primary social ritual of the day. It was a time for the family to reconnect, to share stories of the day's events, and to simply be together after hours of separation and toil. For a brief moment, the hardships of the world outside faded away, replaced by the warmth of the fire and the comfort of a shared, wholesome meal. The difference between this common cena and the aristocratic version of the same name couldn't be more profound. One was a spectacle of obscene wealth. The other was a testament to simplicity, frugality, and the powerful bonding that happens when people share food from a common pot. It was a humble yet deeply human conclusion to the daily struggle, a small but significant victory of nourishment and family in a challenging world. Yet for the vast majority of city dwellers, the true heart of Roman culinary life wasn't found in the private kitchen, which many didn't have, but out on the bustling, noisy, and incredibly crowded streets. Imagine stepping into a typical neighborhood in Rome or Pompeii around midday. The air is thick with the smoke of countless small fires and the unmistakable aroma of sizzling meat, savory stews, and baking bread. This is the world of Roman street food, a vibrant, essential, and deafeningly loud economy that served as the primary source of hot meals for the urban working class. For a population living in cramped, fire-prone apartment blocks where cooking was difficult and dangerous, the countless food stalls and shops were not a luxury. They were an absolute necessity, the ancient equivalent of 1,000 fast food restaurants operating on every corner. The most iconic of these establishments was the thermopolium, a name that literally means a place where something hot is sold. Walking down the street, you would recognize them instantly by their distinctive structure. Built into the ground floor of apartment buildings, they featured a large, L-shaped counter made of brick or stone, with several large terracotta jars called dolia embedded deep into its surface. These weren't just for storage, they were the heart of the operation. Each dolium was a permanent cooking pot, kept constantly simmering over a hidden heat source below, filled with a different hot dish ready to be served immediately. This design was pure genius. It allowed the vendor to efficiently serve a high volume of customers who would simply walk up, order, and eat standing in the street, or take their food away. The counters were often brightly painted with vivid frescoes depicting the gods of hospitality, Mercury, the god of commerce, or images of the very food and drink being sold, acting as a brilliant, eye-catching menu for a largely illiterate clientele. So what was on the menu at a typical thermopolium? The offerings were designed to be hearty, affordable, and bursting with the familiar, umami-rich flavors Romans loved. One of the most popular items was a simple but satisfying lentil or bean stew, slowly cooked for hours until thick and creamy, and undoubtedly seasoned with plenty of garlic and that all-important garum. For a few more coins, you could get a serving of a more substantial meat stew, likely made with cheaper cuts of pork or goat, tenderized through long, slow cooking. Sizzling on a small grill at the end of the counter would be an array of sausages, botulism, and skewers of grilled meat, their smoky scent acting as the best possible advertisement. For a quick handheld snack, there were globuli, delicious fried balls of cheese or dough, and pulse, savory pancakes made from grain and water that could be topped with almost anything. But the thermopolium wasn't the only player in this game. The taberna, a more general shop or tavern, also served hot food and drink, often functioning as a social hub where people could gather for a cup of wine and a hot meal. Then there were the specialized vendors who roamed the streets with portable stalls or set up in the crowded forum. You could find men selling warm chickpeas or lupin beans from a tray, a common and cheap snack eaten like modern peanuts. Others might offer fresh oysters or other shellfish for the slightly more affluent customer. And of course, there were always sellers with baskets of fresh bread, straight from the public bakery. This thriving street food culture tells us something profound about daily life in ancient Rome. It was a society constantly on the move, where the separation between home and work was stark, and the convenience of ready-to-eat food was not a modern invention but an ancient imperative. The constant flow of customers at these counters, soldiers, dockworkers, slaves on errands, shopkeepers, and launders, paints a picture of a city that never stopped, fueled by the quick, hot, and flavorful food served from a jar in a counter. It was a democratic experience, too. While the wealthy might look down on this common fare, everyone from a lowly laborer to a well-off merchant might find themselves at a thermopolium counter for a quick and delicious lunch, united by the simple, universal need for a good meal in the middle of a busy day. This constant reliance on markets, bakeries, and street vendors meant that the daily reality for most Romans was not just about what they ate, but what they could afford. To truly grasp their experience, we have to move beyond the ingredients and into the hard economics of putting food on the table. The struggle was a simple, brutal calculation, balancing the relentless rise and fall of market prices against the stubborn stagnation of a laborer's wage. For the common Roman, life was a precarious financial tightrope, and a bad harvest or a disruption in the grain supply could mean the difference between a full stomach and hunger. Let's break down the numbers. Our best evidence comes from edicts set by Emperor Diocletian in the early 4th century, an attempt to combat rampant inflation by setting maximum prices for goods and wages across the empire. While later than our classical focus, it provides a priceless snapshot of relative values that likely held true for centuries. According to the edict, an unskilled laborer, perhaps someone loading ships at the docks or moving stones on a construction site, would earn about 25 denarii for a full day's work. A common legionary soldier at the time earned a similar rate. Now, what could that wage buy? The same edict sets the maximum price for 1 modius, a Roman dry measure roughly equivalent to 6.5 kilograms or 15 pounds of wheat, at 100 denarii. The math is stark. A single day's wage for a laborer could only purchase a quarter of a modius of wheat. Since a single modius was considered the monthly ration for one adult male, this meant it would take this laborer 4 full days of work just to earn enough to buy the bare minimum of grain to feed himself for a month, with nothing left over for his family, for rent, for oil, for vegetables, or for anything else. This was the fundamental, inescapable pressure of Roman life. The calorie foundation, the wheat, consumed an enormous portion of a household's income before any other expense was even considered. This is why the state's grain dole, the Annona, was not a generous gift but an absolute economic necessity for the survival of the city itself. For those lucky enough to be eligible, it removed that crushing 4-day burden, freeing up that portion of their meager income for other essentials. For everyone else, the non-citizens, the women, the children, the millions of slaves who earned nothing at all, this pressure was immense. Their survival depended entirely on the wages of the male head of household, which had to stretch to cover the entire family's food costs. A sudden price spike, a period of illness that meant missed workdays, or a local shortage could instantly plunge a family into dire circumstances. They would be forced to make terrible choices, switching from wheat to cheaper, less desirable barley, cutting back on protein-rich pulses, or watering down their wine even further. This economic reality is what made the simple, one-pot stew the ultimate expression of working-class ingenuity. It was a way to make that expensive wheat go further by bulking it out with cheaper lentils and vegetables, creating a larger volume of food to feed more mouths from the same precious quantity of grain. It explains the incredible popularity of street food like globuli or grilled sausages. For a single denarius, a worker could get a quick, hot, protein-rich bite without having to purchase, prepare, and cook the raw ingredients themselves, saving both money on fuel and precious time. Every meal was a careful calculation, a testament to resilience in the face of an economy where the cost of basic sustenance was a constant, grinding weight on the shoulders of the people who built the empire. But while the streets of Rome and the kitchens of Italy were defined by wheat, wine, and garum, the Roman Empire was a vast tapestry of conquered lands, each with its own deep culinary traditions. To assume that a common person in Britain ate the same as a common person in Egypt or Gaul would be a profound mistake. The reality was a fascinating negotiation between imperial influence and stubborn local custom. The Roman diet was less a single, monolithic entity and more a set of broad guidelines, a preference for bread over porridge, a taste for fish sauce, a reliance on wine, that were adapted, resisted, and reinterpreted using local ingredients from Scotland to the Sahara. Take Roman Britain, for instance, at the very northern edge of the empire. Here, the Mediterranean's staple crop, wheat, struggled in the colder, wetter climate. While the Roman administration and urban centers would have insisted on imported grain for the army and the elite, the local Celtic British population had long relied on a different grain, oats. Oats thrived where wheat faltered. So, while the ideal Roman meal was bread, the practical reality for a common Briton was far more likely to be a pot of oat porridge, or a flat, dense oatcake griddled over a fire. This wasn't a rejection of Roman culture, but a necessary adaptation. They might flavor their oat stew with native herbs like Celtic nettle or wild garlic instead of imported Mediterranean spices. And for drink, While the Roman legions stationed there drank their customary pasca, the local population clung to their ancient beverage, beer, made from barley, which also grew well in Britain. Beer was the everyday drink for the Celtic peoples, and this tradition continued strong under Roman rule. A soldier from Italy might scoff at the local barley beer, but for a common farmer in a Britannic village, his daily diet was a unique blend, perhaps a Roman-style pottery bowl holding a very British oat and barley stew. Journey now to the other end of the empire, to the incredibly fertile and ancient land of Egypt. Here, Rome encountered a civilization with a food culture even older and more established than its own. Egypt was the empire's breadbasket, the source of the grain that fed Rome itself, so wheat was absolutely central. But for the common Egyptian fellahin or peasant, life revolved around the Nile's cycles, and their diet reflected that. While they grew massive quantities of wheat for export, their own daily bread was often a rougher, darker loaf that could include barley or even sorghum. The truly defining staple of the Egyptian commoner, unchanged by Roman conquest, was the humble onion, which was consumed in colossal quantities by all classes, eaten raw with bread as a fundamental part of every meal. And while the Roman garum jars certainly made their way to Alexandria, the local condiment of choice remained a fermented fish sauce of their own making, revealing that even the mighty garum had regional competitors. The Roman influence in Egypt was primarily extractive, taking the wheat and other resources, but it did little to change the millennia-old eating habits of the common people, who continued their traditional diet under a new administrative flag. In Gaul, modern-day France, we see perhaps the most successful and lasting fusion of Roman and local culinary traditions. The Gauls were not primitive. They had a sophisticated agricultural society and were renowned for their pig farming and ham production long before the Romans arrived. When Rome conquered Gaul, they didn't just impose their diet. They recognized a good thing and adopted it. The Gauls' skill in animal husbandry, particularly with pigs and sausages, was eagerly embraced by the Romans. A common person in Roman Gaul would have eaten more pork and ham than their Italian counterpart, thanks to this deep local expertise. They also incorporated their native beers alongside Roman wine, creating a beverage culture with more choice. But they also adopted Roman tastes with gusto. Archaeological evidence shows that Gaul became a massive production center for amphorae of Roman-style fish sauce, indicating that garum wasn't just an import, but was being manufactured locally for a growing market that had acquired the Roman palate. The common Gallo-Roman's meal was thus a hearty hybrid, a pork sausage from a local recipe, grilled over a fire and seasoned with a fish sauce made in a nearby factory using Roman methods, accompanied by a coarse wheat bread and washed down with either local beer or cheap local wine. This incredible regional diversity shows that the Roman diet for a common person was a fluid concept. It was less about strict adherence to a menu from Rome and more about a gradual process of cultural exchange. Local ingredients and traditions proved incredibly resilient. The empire provided new technologies like improved mills and ovens, new trade goods like olives and wine, and a new culinary prestige associated with certain foods like bread and fish sauce. But in the end, the common person, from a Scottish hill fort to an Egyptian village, always ate what the land provided. Their diet was a practical, daily testament to the fact that while the Romans could build roads, walls, and aqueducts, they could never completely conquer the local dinner table. With the constant threat of hunger looming, especially during the long winter months when fresh produce was a distant memory, the ability to preserve food wasn't just a culinary skill for the Romans. It was a matter of survival. Every season of abundance was a race against time, a frantic effort to capture and imprison the bounty of summer and autumn to see a family through the barren weeks ahead. Without the luxury of refrigeration, they relied on a suite of brilliant, time-tested techniques that harnessed the fundamental forces of nature: the dehydrating power of sun and wind, the antimicrobial shield of salt and smoke, and the preserving magic of acidic fermentation. For a common Roman household, a well-stocked larder of preserved goods was the ultimate symbol of security and prudent management, a tangible buffer against the uncertainty of the future. The most widespread and vital method was salting. Salt was far more than a seasoning. It was a lifeline, a precious commodity so important that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid with it, giving us the word salary. The principle was simple yet effective. Salt draws moisture out of food through a process called osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria cannot thrive and spoil the meat. This technique was applied most famously to pork, the most common meat source. After the annual autumn slaughter, a pig would be meticulously butchered, and its cuts, especially the legs, flanks, and belly, would be packed in layers of salt. The salt would penetrate deep into the meat, curing it and transforming it into long-lasting provisions like perna ham, patasso shoulder bacon, and laridum's salt pork. These salty, hard slabs of meat could be stored for months or even years. When it was time to eat, a small piece would be cut off, soaked in water to remove some of the saltiness, and then added to a pot of beans or lentils, where it would simmer for hours, imparting a rich, savory, meaty flavor to the entire dish, making a little bit of protein go an incredibly long way. But the power of salt wasn't limited to meat. It was also the essential ingredient in creating Rome's most iconic condiment, garum. The massive production of this fish sauce was, at its core, a monumental preservation project. By layering countless small, oily fish with vast quantities of salt and leaving them to ferment, Romans weren't just making a flavorful sauce. They were using the salt to break down and preserve the nutritional content of immense quantities of fish that would have otherwise spoiled within days. The resulting liquid was a stable, shelf-stable concentrate of umami and salt that could last for years in an amphora, a perfect example of turning perishable seafood into a permanent, tradable commodity. Even vegetables weren't immune to the power of salt. Items like green beans, cabbage, and turnips could be packed in salt or strong brine, a process that preserved them through the winter, albeit leaving them incredibly salty and requiring a thorough rinse before they could be eaten. Alongside salting, drying was another universally employed technique, leveraging the sun and wind to remove the moisture that decay-causing microorganisms need to survive. The most common application was for fruits. The summer and autumn harvests of figs, grapes, plums, and apples would be laid out on mats, on rooftops, or on special drying racks and left to bask in the hot Mediterranean sun. As the water evaporated, the fruits would shrivel, their sugars would concentrate, and they would become chewy, nutritious, and impervious to spoilage. These dried fruits, figs, raisins, plums became crucial sources of energy and vitamins during the winter. They were eaten as snacks, added to breads and porridges for sweetness, and were a vital part of a soldier's marching ration. Herbs were also hung in bundles from the rafters to dry, preserving their aromatic qualities for use in cooking and medicine throughout the year. For those who lived near the coast, small fish like sardines and anchovies were often gutted and laid out to dry in the sun, creating a cheap, protein-rich, and pungent snack that could be stored for months. In the northern, less sunny provinces like Britain and Gaul, where the climate was less conducive to sun drying, smoking provided an alternative. Meat and fish would be suspended high above a slow, smoldering fire in a specially built smokehouse. The smoke itself acted as a preservative in two ways. The heat helped to dry the food, while the chemicals in the smoke, like phenols and formaldehyde, had antimicrobial properties that further inhibited spoilage. This process infused the food with a distinctive, rich, smoky flavor and created a tough, leathery exterior that protected the interior. Smoked hams and sausages from Gaul were particularly famous throughout the empire, prized for their flavor and longevity. Even cheese was sometimes smoked to extend its shelf life and add a new dimension of taste. Finally, the Romans were masters of pickling through fermentation, a process that uses beneficial bacteria to preserve food. The most common pickled items were vegetables, a technique that allowed them to enjoy a taste of summer crunch long into the winter. Vegetables like cabbages, turnips, cucumbers, and onions would be submerged in a brine of salt and water and left to ferment. The naturally occurring lactic acid bacteria on the vegetables would feed on the sugars, producing lactic acid. This acid not only preserved the vegetables, giving them a characteristic tangy flavor, but also created an environment hostile to harmful bacteria. The result was a stable, probiotic-rich food that could be stored for months in its own brine. The most famous example is likely a form of sauerkraut, which was a staple for Roman soldiers on campaign, valued both for its ability to last without refrigeration and for its purported health benefits, possibly helping to prevent scurvy on long marches. This clever use of fermentation, like all their preservation methods, was a testament to the Romans' deep understanding of their natural world and their relentless drive to conquer the one enemy they could never fully defeat, time itself. This sprawling network of supply and preservation, however, found its most disciplined and impactful expression in the diet of the Roman legionary. The army was a massive, mobile city, and feeding it was a logistical feat that required standardization, efficiency, and incredible portability. The result was a diet that became a powerful engine of culinary change, carrying the tastes of Italy and the practicalities of military life to the farthest corners of the empire, and, in turn, picking up local flavors along the way. The common soldier's daily ration was a masterpiece of caloric and practical engineering, built on a core of wheat, supplemented by lardum, that salt-cured bacon-hard cheese, and, of course, the ever-present pasca. This wasn't just food, it was fuel for conquest, and its distribution created a unique form of ancient globalization. Consider the sheer scale of this operation. A single legion of around 5,000 men required over 2.5 tons of grain every single day just to meet the basic ration. To secure this, the Roman state didn't just hope for local provisions. It often fundamentally reshaped the agricultural landscape of a new province. In newly conquered territories like Britain or Dacia, the army would immediately work to identify fertile land suited for growing the specific types of wheat the legionaries preferred. They would then either compel local farmers to grow it or, more commonly, establish vast imperial estates dedicated solely to supplying the nearby legions. This created an instant, massive, and reliable market for a specific type of agriculture that simply hadn't existed before. A local farmer who might have traditionally grown oats or barley now had a powerful economic incentive to switch to wheat because the army would pay for it, and pay consistently. This military demand is a key reason why bread, not porridge, became the aspirational staple across the empire. It was the food of the powerful, well-supplied soldier. But the army's influence went far beyond just creating wheat farms. The legionary fortress itself became a hub of production and consumption that could utterly transform a local economy. Surrounding every major camp, a bustling civilian settlement called a canopy would inevitably spring up. These towns were filled with merchants, artisans, and, most importantly for our story, farmers and food vendors, all eager to cater to the soldiers' needs and tastes. A soldier, unlike a destitute local peasant, received his regular pay and had a consistent appetite. Local farmers would learn that the legionaries had a taste for certain vegetables like onions, cabbages, and garlic, and would grow them to sell at the camp market. Local pastoralists would find a ready buyer for their sheep and goats to supply milk for the cheese that was a staple of the military diet. The army's insatiable demand for preserved pork created a booming market for salt, encouraging the development of salt pans and mines across the provinces. This economic gravity pulled local agricultural practices toward the Roman model, not through force, but through the irresistible pull of hard currency. The interaction, however, was never a one-way street. While the army spread Roman foodways, it was also a sponge, absorbing and adopting local ingredients and customs. A legionary stationed on the Rhine frontier for 20 years would develop a taste for the local barley beer, even if his official ration was Posca. Troops in Britain would come to appreciate native oysters, and those in the eastern provinces would encounter new spices and cooking methods. There's compelling archaeological evidence from military sites, particularly in Britain and Germany, showing that soldiers' diets were far more varied than the official ration list suggests. Botanical remains from barracks reveal they were eating local fruits, nuts, and vegetables, and even using native herbs like coriander and dill to season their food. This created a fascinating hybrid cuisine. A soldier might use his issued wheat to bake bread in a Roman-style clay oven, but top it with a locally produced cheese and wash it down with a Celtic-style beer. He was, in effect, a walking fusion of imperial standardization and provincial adaptation. Perhaps the most profound impact came when veterans retired. After 25 years of service, a soldier was granted a plot of land, often in the province where he had served. This meant that thousands of men, now accustomed to a diet of wheat bread, olive oil, and wine, were dispersed in the countryside to become farmers and community leaders. They would plant vineyards, olive groves, and wheat fields using techniques learned in the army, and they would raise their families with a palate shaped by their decades of service. Their very presence acted as a permanent seed of Roman culinary culture, planted deep within the province. The standardized, practical, and portable diet of the Roman legionary did more than just feed an army. It acted as a massive cultural blender, slowly homogenizing tastes across the Mediterranean world and beyond, creating a common culinary language that still whispers to us from archaeological sites and historical records today. Yet for all their ingenuity in preservation and the might of the Annona, the Roman food supply was terrifyingly fragile, balanced on a knife's edge where a single season of bad weather or a few weeks of disrupted shipping could plunge the entire system into chaos. The specter of famine was an ever-present fear in the ancient world, a dark shadow that loomed over the lives of the common people, for whom a failed harvest didn't mean higher prices at the market. It meant the very real and immediate threat of starvation. This vulnerability was baked into the very structure of the empire's logistics, making the abundance of a good year feel fleeting and the desperation of a bad one feel inevitable. The causes of these crises were numerous and often interconnected. The most common trigger was simply the weather. Roman agriculture was entirely at the mercy of the climate. A drought at the wrong time could stunt the growth of wheat, leaving stalks thin and heads empty. Conversely, too much rain during the harvest could ruin the grain, causing it to sprout or rot in the fields. A late frost could decimate the vulnerable buds of olive trees and grapevines, wiping out not just food but the crucial oil and wine that were also dietary staples. Since the entire Mediterranean basin often experienced similar weather patterns, a bad year in Italy could coincide with a bad year in Sicily or even North Africa, eliminating the usual safety net of importing from a neighboring region. Beyond nature's whims, human failures and manipulations could be just as devastating. Piracy or conflict could disrupt the vital sea lanes, preventing the grain fleets from Alexandria from reaching Ostia. Within the city, the system was horrifyingly vulnerable to speculation and profiteering. The Annona supplied a basic ration, but it didn't cover everything, and the open market for additional food was ruthlessly exploited by wealthy merchants and landowners. These men, known as mercators or negotiators, would often engage in hoarding. Upon hearing rumors of a poor harvest or a delayed fleet, they would buy up massive quantities of available grain and hold it in their private warehouses, artificially creating a scarcity to drive prices to astronomical levels. For the elite, a food shortage was a financial opportunity. For the laborer whose entire day's wage could suddenly only buy a single loaf of bread, it was a death sentence. The impact of these shortages fell almost exclusively on the poor. The wealthy, with their vast country estates producing their own food and their immense wealth to buy whatever was available, were largely insulated. But for the urban masses who lived hand to mouth, a sudden price spike meant immediate and terrible choices. Families would be forced to spend their entire income on bread alone, leaving nothing for rent, oil, or vegetables. They would begin watering down their pasca until it was little more than discolored water. They would switch from wheat to barley, and then when even barley became too expensive, they would turn to famine foods, boiled weeds, bran normally used for animal feed, sawdust, and even clay. Malnourishment would set in quickly, weakening bodies and making them susceptible to disease. The death rate, always high among the poor, would skyrocket, with the very young and the very old dying first. This desperate hunger frequently boiled over into public anger, and the target was always the state. The emperor's fundamental bargain with the people of Rome was panem et circenses, bread and circuses. If the bread failed to appear, the circus lost its power to distract. The forums and streets would fill with angry, desperate crowds. These were not organized protests, but explosive food riots. The mob would often march on the public granaries, demanding the immediate release of stores. They would target the warehouses of the suspected hoarders, sometimes breaking in and seizing grain, other times setting the buildings ablaze. They would surround the Senate House or even the emperor's palace, shouting curses and hurling stones. The prefect of the Annona would find himself in the crosshairs of public fury, his name chanted as the cause of their suffering. The political pressure on an emperor during a famine was immense. His legitimacy rested on his ability to feed the city. History records several emperors, like Augustus, taking direct, dramatic action to quell riots and alleviate shortages. They would dip into the state treasury to make emergency purchases of grain at any price, even from the very speculators causing the problem. They would personally appear before the crowds to distribute food and promise action, a dangerous but necessary public relations move. A prolonged famine could shatter an emperor's reputation and become a catalyst for rebellion or assassination. The grain dole was more than a welfare program. It was a pillar of imperial power, and when it wobbled, the entire political structure trembled. The full belly of a common Roman was, quite literally, the foundation of the Pax Romana, and its emptiness was the single greatest threat to the stability of the ancient world's greatest empire. But beyond the immediate struggle for daily bread, food held a deeper spiritual significance for the common Roman, woven into the very fabric of their faith and domestic life. For them, the gods were not distant, abstract figures, but intimate presences involved in every aspect of the household's well-being. And the most fundamental way to honor this relationship was through the sharing of food. At the heart of every humble home, no matter how small or cramped, was a small shrine called the lararium. This wasn't an ornate altar, but a simple shelf or niche, often painted on a wall, that served as the sacred dwelling place for the lares, the protective spirits of the household and the family's ancestors. Maintaining a good relationship with these spirits was considered essential for the family's prosperity, health, and protection from misfortune. And this relationship was nourished literally through small, daily offerings from the family's own meals. The practice was beautifully simple and deeply personal. Before the family sat down to their own cena, the paterfamilias, the head of the household, would take a small portion of their food, a pinch of grain from their porridge, a few crumbs of bread, a few drops of wine diluted with water, or perhaps a few beans from the stew, and place it gently into a small fire on the altar or simply leave it on a special plate. This act, seemingly minor, was profound. It was a way of including the divine in the family's daily routine, of saying thank you for the sustenance they had received, and of asking for continued protection. It acknowledged that the food on their table was a blessing that required gratitude. For a poor family, this act of giving up even a tiny morsel was a significant gesture of piety, a tangible investment in their spiritual and physical security. The smell of the burning offering the grain, the wine was believed to be particularly pleasing to the lares, a sensory prayer rising from the hearth to the heavens. This daily ritual grounded their faith in the most basic human experience, sharing a meal. It transformed their simple nourishment into a sacrament, a constant reminder that the divine was present not in grand temples alone, but right there in their humble kitchen, watching over the family's pot of stew. While the household gods received these quiet, personal offerings, the state religion offered the common people a far more dramatic and materially rewarding form of worship, the public sacrifice. Major religious festivals and holidays, which were frequent on the Roman calendar, were marked by grand ceremonies in the forums and temples. At the center of these spectacles was the ritual slaughter of animals, oxen, sheep, pigs, and bulls, an awe-inspiring display of piety and state power funded by wealthy officials or the emperor himself. The religious procedure was elaborate. The animal, perfectly chosen and adorned with garlands, would be led in a procession to the altar. A priest would then sprinkle sacred meal on its head, and if the animal bowed in acceptance, it was seen as a favorable omen. After a prayer was recited, the animal was quickly and expertly sacrificed. For the vast crowds of ordinary citizens gathered to watch, the religious pageantry was thrilling, but the most anticipated moment came after the sacred rites were complete. Only a small portion of the animal, the organs, and a token piece of meat was actually burned on the altar for the gods. The vast majority of the carcass, now blessed by its offering, was butchered on the spot by temple attendants. This meat was then distributed, often for free or at a symbolic price, to the people in attendance. For the urban poor, this was a windfall. It was a rare and joyous opportunity to eat fresh, high-quality meat, a luxury that was almost never within their financial reach. A family might receive a good-sized portion of pork or beef from a state sacrifice, turning an ordinary evening meal into a festive occasion that felt divinely sanctioned. This system created a powerful feedback loop of faith and patronage. The elite gained prestige and public favor by funding these lavish displays of public piety, demonstrating their generosity and their connection to the gods. The common people, in turn, received both spiritual fulfillment and a tangible, nutritious benefit. Their participation in the state religion was reinforced by a full stomach. It made the gods and the state that served them seem generous and caring. The smoke from the altar wasn't just a spiritual offering. It was the smell of a community barbecue on a massive scale, a divinely ordained social safety net that provided both a rare dietary treat and a powerful sense of inclusion in the larger Roman community. Their faith, therefore, was not just a matter of belief. It was a practical partnership with the divine, where offerings at home ensured daily protection, and attendance at public festivals could put a feast on the table. Now, with this rich tapestry of their daily diet laid out before us, it's time to clear the table of some persistent modern myths. When we picture Italian food today, our minds instantly jump to a plate of steaming pasta with tomato sauce, or perhaps a pizza topped with peppers and cheese. It's a delicious image, but it's one that would have been utterly incomprehensible to a citizen of ancient Rome. The truth is, some of the most iconic ingredients we associate with Italian cuisine were completely absent from the entire European continent until centuries after the Roman Empire had fallen. The single biggest factor that separates their culinary world from ours is an event known as the Columbian Exchange. This was the monumental, often devastating, transfer of plants, animals, and diseases between the Americas and the rest of the world that began with Christopher Columbus's voyages in the late 1400s. For the Romans, living over 1,000 years earlier, the vast and incredible food wealth of the Americas was an entire hemisphere of flavor that simply did not exist in their known world. This means that a whole category of foundational modern foods was entirely missing from their kitchens. Let's start with the most glaring absence, the tomato. It is impossible to overstate how central the tomato is to modern Italian cooking, but in ancient Rome, it was unknown. This vibrant, acidic fruit, which forms the base of so many sauces, would not arrive in Europe until Spanish conquistadors brought it back from its native South America. The same is true for every variety of pepper, from the sweet bell pepper to the fiery chili pepper. Roman food lacked that specific kind of capsicum heat and sweetness. Their spice palette was built on black pepper, which was imported at great expense from India, along with other aromatics like ginger and cinnamon. But the chili pepper, which would eventually transform cuisines across the globe, was another American novelty that arrived far too late for any legionary to spice his pulse with a dash of cayenne. Perhaps the most surprising absence for many is the potato. This humble tuber, a dietary cornerstone for much of the modern world, is another South American native. The Roman diet relied on grains for its carbohydrate foundation, not tubers. They had turnips, parsnips, and carrots, but the high-yield, calorie-dense potato that would later prevent famines and fuel populations across Europe was a future revelation. Even the common green bean, a fixture in so many of our vegetable dishes, is a New World plant. The Romans had their own beloved broad beans or fava beans, but the string bean or kidney bean was not something they could cultivate. And what about pasta? This is a tricky one, as the Romans did have a concept of flour and water dough that was boiled. They ate a dish called lagana, which consisted of sheets of pastry dough that were sometimes boiled, and a simple dough mixture called tracta that was used to thicken stews. But this was a far cry from the dried, durum wheat semolina pasta shapes we know today. The innovation of extruding dough through dyes to create long-lasting, dry forms like spaghetti and macaroni is a later development, with strong evidence pointing to its popularization in the Arab world and its subsequent introduction to Italy, well after the classical period. So while a Roman might recognize the basic ingredients, the plate of spaghetti bolognese with its American tomato sauce and its specific pasta shape is a thoroughly modern invention. This reorientation of our perspective is crucial. It forces us to see Roman food on its own terms, not through the lens of later culinary revolutions. Their world of flavor was built on a different foundation. The trinity of wheat, olives, and grapes, the umami punch of fermented fish sauce, the pungent kick of garlic and onions, and the precious imported spices from the East. When we remove the foods of the Americas from the picture, we start to appreciate the true ingenuity of their cuisine. Their creativity wasn't in crafting a tomato sauce, but in discovering how to transform fish guts into a prized condiment, or how to preserve pork and salt to flavor 100 pots of beans. Their culinary genius lies in what they did with what they had, not in what they lacked. By setting aside our modern assumptions, we can finally begin to taste the ancient world as it truly was. So let's bring all of these ingredients and this way of life into sharp, tangible focus by recreating one of the most personal and relatable dishes from the ancient world. A recipe that has miraculously survived not in a cookbook, but in a poem. Tucked away in the Appendix Virgiliana, a collection of works once attributed to the great poet Virgil, is a delightful piece simply titled Mortem. It offers us a priceless window into the kitchen of a small, self-sufficient farmer, a man preparing his simple daily meal entirely from what he grows and produces himself. This isn't a patrician feast. It's a portrait of rustic, hands-on cooking, and it gives us a recipe we can almost taste today. The poem introduces us to a farmer named Simulus, who wakes before dawn and realizes he has nothing but plain bread to eat. Rather than despair, he decides to make mortem, a simple spread to give his meal flavor. The name itself is thought to come from the Latin word mortarium, meaning mortar, which is the very tool at the heart of its creation. We follow him as he steps into his small, well-tended garden, a vital source of pride and sustenance, to gather his ingredients. He carefully selects a head of garlic, a generous bunch of fresh cilantro, some rustic cheese, a few stalks of celery, and some rue, a bitter herb popular in Roman cooking. He also grabs a pinch of salt and reaches for his small stash of olive oil and vinegar. This humble shopping list, pulled straight from the earth, is about to be transformed. Back in his humble kitchen, the real work begins, and it is a visceral, sensory process. He first peels the garlic cloves, and the poem wonderfully describes how the pungent odor immediately brings tears to his eyes, a universal experience any cook will recognize. He then adds the coarse grains of salt to the mortar, using them as an abrasive. He begins to grind, crushing the garlic and salt together into a smooth, fragrant paste. The repetitive, rhythmic scraping of the pestle against the clay mortar is the soundtrack to this ancient cooking show. Next, he adds the handful of leafy green herbs, the cilantro, the celery leaves, the rue, and continues to grind, pulverizing them and releasing their vibrant, chlorophyll-rich oils, which streak through the pale garlic paste with brilliant green color. The sharp, aromatic scent of the herbs now mingles with the aggressive punch of the garlic, filling the small room. Now for the rich element, the cheese. Similis uses a good-sized chunk of what was certainly a firm, salty sheep or goat's milk cheese, perhaps similar to a modern ricotta salata or a young pecorino. He breaks this into rough pieces and adds it to the mortar. As he grinds again, the cheese incorporates with the green paste, changing the texture entirely. It becomes thicker, creamier, and paler, taking on a speckled, marbled appearance from the herbs. Finally, he adds a single splash of sharp vinegar for tang and a drizzle of golden olive oil to smooth everything out and bind it into a cohesive, spreadable consistency. He gives it one final, vigorous mix, and his mortem is complete. The poet describes the final product as having a variegated color, not completely green, for the milk-white cheese tempers it, nor shining white, for it is colored by so many herbs. He then takes his freshly baked loaf, still warm from the local baker, and breaks off a piece. He spreads the thick, fragrant mortem on the coarse bread, and finally takes a bite. This simple act of taking raw, homegrown ingredients and, through the simple technology of a mortar and pestle, creating something bursting with complex, pungent, and satisfying flavor, epitomizes the ingenuity of the common Roman table. It was a way to turn basic staples into something special, a small daily ritual of creation and enjoyment that connected them directly to the land they tended. Making mortem today is perhaps the closest we can come to tasting the true, unvarnished flavor of ancient Rome, a taste not of imperial power, but of quiet, domestic self-reliance. Given this daily reliance on grains and pulses, we can paint a fairly clear picture of the common Romans' nutritional profile. Their diet was overwhelmingly carbohydrate-rich, providing the dense caloric energy needed for manual labor. A breakfast of bread, a lunch of more bread and cheese, and an evening meal of grain-based stew meant they were fueled by a steady burn of complex carbs. This was paired with a surprisingly good intake of fiber from their whole grain breads, lentils, beans, and vegetables, which would have promoted digestive health. Furthermore, the widespread consumption of legumes like chickpeas and fava beans provided a crucial plant-based source of protein and essential amino acids, especially vital when meat was a rare luxury. The liberal use of onions, garlic, and seasonal vegetables, along with fruits like figs, would have supplied various vitamins and minerals, making their diet, in times of stability, reasonably well-rounded and sufficient for survival. However, this dietary foundation had significant weaknesses and hidden dangers. The most glaring issue was the ever-present threat of deficiency. While they had access to vitamin C from fresh fruits and vegetables, these were highly seasonal. During the long winter months, reliance on stored grains and dried legumes could lead to scurvy, a fact supported by skeletal evidence showing signs of the disease. Perhaps the most widespread problem was iron deficiency anemia. While lentils and beans contain iron, it is a form that is not as easily absorbed by the body as the heme iron found in meat. For the many commoners who rarely ate red meat, this often resulted in chronic anemia. Analysis of Roman skeletons from all social classes reveals a high prevalence of porotic hyperostosis, a condition where the skull bones become spongy and porous, a classic sign of long-term iron deficiency. This would have led to widespread fatigue, weakness, and a reduced ability to fight off infections, a constant struggle for a population living in densely packed and unsanitary cities. Then there was the silent, grinding enemy in their most cherished staple, bread. The flour used for panis plebeius was ground using massive, heavy Roman millstones made of volcanic rock. These stones were incredibly effective but had a fatal flaw. They were not precision instruments. With every rotation, they would shed minuscule, abrasive particles of stone and sand into the flour. Furthermore, the flour itself was often only coarsely sifted, leaving behind not just the nutritious bran, but also fine grit from the milling process. This meant that with every mouthful of the dark, coarse bread that was the backbone of their diet, common Romans were slowly and steadily sanding down their teeth. Archaeologists examining Roman skeletons consistently find teeth worn down to the stump, often by early adulthood, even in young individuals with no signs of decay. This extreme wear exposed the pulp cavity, leading to agonizing abscesses, infections, and tooth loss that could have fatal consequences in an era before modern dentistry. Their very sustenance was literally eroding their health with every bite. The health landscape for the wealthy patrician was, as in life, a world apart, but it came with a completely different set of ailments. Freed from the gritty bread and limited portions of the poor, the elite indulged in a diet dangerously high in saturated fats and exotic luxuries. Their tables groaned with rich meats, fatty sausages, and elaborate dishes drenched in heavy sauces. While this provided ample protein and calories, it likely contributed to conditions like gout, a painful form of arthritis linked to rich foods and alcohol, and atherosclerosis, the hardening of the arteries. The Roman upper class was also prone to lead poisoning, though not necessarily from their water pipes as once thought. The primary culprit was their prized sweetener, sappa or defrutum, a syrup made by boiling down grape mussed in lead-lined pots. The acidic grape juice would leach lead from the pots, creating a sweet, toxic concentrate used to preserve fruit and sweeten wine. Chronic lead poisoning leads to a host of terrible symptoms: abdominal pain, memory loss, mood disorders, infertility, and gout. The erratic behavior and health problems of some later emperors have even been speculatively linked to this insidious poisoning from their own luxurious pantry. So, when we compare the two, we see a stark nutritional divide defined by access, not wisdom. The common Roman faced a constant battle against the deficiencies of scarcity, fighting anemia and vitamin shortages with a diet built for caloric survival above all else, while their teeth were slowly destroyed by the very bread that kept them alive. The wealthy Roman, by contrast, succumbed to the diseases of excess gout and lead toxicity from a diet of unrestrained abundance. One group was undermined by the grit in their flour, the other by the poison in their wine. Their skeletons tell this tale of two diets, one marked by the spongy skull of anemia and teeth ground down to nubs, the other by the telltale signs of gouty arthritis and the chemical signature of lead. In the end, neither diet was optimal. Each was a product of its social standing, and each carried a heavy price for the body, a direct consequence of one's place at the Roman table. But to truly move beyond the texts and ledgers and into the tangible reality of a Roman meal, we must take a journey to a place where time itself stood still. The city of Pompeii, preserved under meters of volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, offers us an unparalleled window into the daily life of the ancient world. And nowhere is this more vivid than in the realm of food. Here, history is not inferred. It is excavated, brushed clean, and laid bare before our eyes. The catastrophic event that ended the city did something remarkable. It froze the bustling culinary life of a Roman town in a single, fateful moment, providing us with a snapshot so detailed It feels almost like walking through a market that has only just closed for the day. The most striking evidence comes from the city's bakeries. Stepping into one, like the famous bakery of Modestus, is to witness a moment of frantic, interrupted industry. The large stone mills, used for grinding grain into flour, stand exactly as they were left, with the volcanic debris still clinging to them. And in one such bakery, archaeologists made a breathtaking discovery: several loaves of bread, perfectly carbonized by the searing heat of the pyroclastic flow. These are not abstract concepts of bread. They are the real physical objects, preserved in exact, heartbreaking detail. They are round, exactly as described in texts, and scored deeply into 8 wedges, a practical design that made them easy to break and share among a family or a group of workers. You can see the baker's stamp on the crust, a brand name from 2 millennia ago. To stand before these loaves in a museum is a profoundly moving experience. You are not just learning that Romans ate bread, you are seeing the very loaf that was pulled from the oven on the morning of August 24th, a breakfast that was never eaten, a life interrupted mid-bite. This incredible preservation extends to the very ingredients that flavored that bread. In the pantry of a house known as the House of the Ship Europa, excavators found a humble, upside-down clay pot. When they carefully lifted it, they discovered its contents had been perfectly sealed for centuries. A hoard of ancient chickpeas, their smooth, round forms instantly recognizable. In other homes, carbonized figs, walnuts, and even a bowl of eggs were found. One egg tragically crushed by the falling debris. Perhaps most evocative of all is the fruit. In the garden of one villa, the cavities left by the roots of fruit trees were found and used to create plaster casts, revealing the exact shape of the trees that grew there. And in a basket left behind in a hurry, a cluster of dates was discovered, their wrinkled, caramelized forms looking as if they could have been dried just last year. These are not the treasures of kings. They are the groceries of common people, a shopping list turned to stone, reminding us that the people of Pompeii were not so different from us, just individuals with meals to plan and pantries to stock. And then there are the thermopolia, those ubiquitous Roman fast food counters. In Pompeii, over 150 have been identified, and they are not ruins. They are frozen businesses. Walking through the city's streets, you can approach these counters exactly as a hungry customer would have 200 years ago. The large dole jars are still embedded in the counters, and scientific analysis of residues inside them has confirmed what was sold. In one jar, traces of a meat and vegetable stew. In another, a dish of snails. In a third, the unmistakable chemical signature of garum. At one particularly well-preserved thermopolium on the Via della Bendanza, the counter is still adorned with its vibrant frescoes, painted images of a chicken and partridges, perhaps the house specialties, next to a depiction of the god of commerce, Mercury. It is so complete, so immediate, that you can almost hear the clamor of the lunchtime rush, smell the sizzling sausages, and see the proprietor dipping his ladle in the jar to serve a steaming portion to a worker on his break. This is the ultimate gift of Pompeii. It transforms our understanding from academic knowledge into visceral, human connection. We don't just know they ate bread, we can see the baker's mark on it. We don't just know they used fish sauce, we can find the amphory it was shipped in, stacked in a shop. We don't just know they snacked on fruit and nuts, we can see the very walnuts they were about to crack open. The people of Pompeii were not preparing for death. They were preparing their next meal. And in that simple, universal act, frozen forever by tragedy, They speak to us across the centuries with a clarity and a poignancy that no history book could ever achieve. Imagine your entire family gathering around a single, well-worn pot resting on a small brazier, the steam rising with the humble aroma of boiled vegetables and garlic. This is the evening meal, the cena, for the vast majority of Romans. The pot holds a thick, hearty stew, a simple, nourishing blend of boiled spelt or barley, whatever lentils or beans were affordable that week, and diced onions, leeks, and cabbage from the small market garden. A generous splash of pungent garum and a few precious herbs provide the only seasoning. This one pot wonder is served directly into coarse pottery bowls, and the family shares it, using chunks of dark, gritty panis plebeius to sop up every last bit. There is no meat, save perhaps a few slivers of salty bacon used to flavor the entire pot. The conversation is quiet, focused on the day's events and the challenges of tomorrow. This meal is not about pleasure or entertainment. It is a functional act of refueling, a brief moment of warmth and togetherness after a long day of manual labor, a small victory of sustenance in a life defined by hard work and economic precarity. Now, let that scene dissolve and transport yourself to a lavish triclinium, a formal dining room in a palatial villa. The air is thick with the scent of exotic incense and roasting meats. A wealthy patrician, Gaius, is hosting a feast for his political allies, and the spectacle is just beginning. This is also called a cena, but the word itself feels inadequate to describe the experience. The guests recline on couches, served by a small army of silent, attentive slaves. The meal unfolds not as a single course, but as a relentless procession of dishes designed to stun the senses and display the host's nearly infinite wealth. It begins with the gustatio, the appetizer course, platters of oysters shipped live from Brundisium in saltwater tanks, eggs topped with caviar, and dormice stuffed with minced pork and pine nuts, all drizzled with the finest garum soserum. After this, the mensa prima, the main course, arrives. This is where the true excess begins. Whole roast boars, brought to the table on massive silver platters, are presented as if they are still alive, with smaller birds arranged in their mouths. Peacocks, their spectacular tail feathers reattached after roasting, are paraded around the room before being carved. There are dishes we can scarcely imagine today: flamingo tongues, sows udders, and even dishes where live birds fly out of a cooked pig when it is cut open. The flavors are a chaotic symphony of the expensive and the imported. Dishes are heavy with long pepper from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, and laser, a rare and priceless sap from North Africa. The wine is not the sharp, watered-down vinum ordinarium of the taverns, but fine, aged Falernian, served mixed with hot water and snow brought down from the mountains at great expense. The social purpose of this meal could not be more different from the common family stew. This is not about nourishment, it is about power. Each exotic dish is a calculated display of resources and global connections. The conversation is a complex dance of politics and patronage, with the host solidifying alliances and demonstrating his status. The feast could last for 6 hours or more, and the sheer volume of food is so immense that guests would often vomit using a special vessel called a vomitorium to make room for more, a practice meant to showcase their ability to consume far beyond physical need. The inequality is not just in the food itself, but in the entire philosophy behind it. For the common Roman, food was about survival. For the patrician, it was about transforming immense wealth into social and political capital, a performance where the sheer waste was a central part of the message. The gulf between these two experiences, both happening in the same city on the same evening, was the most visceral and undeniable proof of one's place in the Roman world. Your meal was your social status, served on a platter. So as our journey through the Roman kitchen comes to a close, what can we truly say was on the plate of a normal person? It was a diet built on a foundation of stark, brilliant practicality, a testament to the ingenuity of making a lot from very little. At its heart was wheat, transformed into a daily bowl of pulse or a coarse, gritty loaf of bread, the true fuel that powered an empire. It was defined by a profound social divide, where the spectacular excess of a patrician's multi-course feast stood in shocking contrast to the humble, one-pot stew of the common family, a daily reminder that your meal was the most direct indicator of your place in the world. Yet to call it monotonous or bland would be a grave mistake. This was a cuisine that found incredible depth and flavor in its limitations. It was a world pungent with garlic and onions, enriched by the salty, umami punch of garum, and sweetened by the simple, seasonal joy of fresh figs or a handful of raisins. It was a diet that was surprisingly diverse within its means, drawing on a whole pantry of legumes, vegetables, and preserved goods. It was a flavor profile born not of extravagance, but of necessity and a deep connection to the local land and sea. Perhaps the most powerful takeaway is to reflect on our own modern relationship with food. For us, a global supply chain brings the world to our supermarket shelves, offering a staggering array of choices regardless of the season. For the ancient Roman, a bad harvest or a delayed grain ship wasn't an inconvenience. It was a life or death crisis. Their daily struggle for sustenance underscores a privilege we often take for granted, the simple, profound security of knowing where our next meal will come from. As you go about your day, maybe stopping for a coffee or planning your dinner, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What surprised you the most about the Roman table? Was it the absolute ubiquity of fish sauce, the gritty reality of their bread, or the sheer logistical miracle of the Annona that kept 1 million people fed? Share your biggest revelation in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. Because the story of what people eat is ultimately the story of who they are, and the common Roman, with their bowl of pulse and their hardened loaf of bread, has a story that is far more fascinating, more human, and more relatable than any tale of imperial excess.